Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Surface Tension, the podcast from Shobana Jayasingh Dance. I'm Sanjoy Roy, dance critic for The Guardian. This year, the company turns 30, and to mark the occasion, we're producing a series of podcasts discussing the work and chatting to an incredible range of people who've collaborated with Shobana over the years, including composers, dance artists, filmmakers, as well as writers, designers, scientists, and even robotic engineers. In episode 1, I spoke to Shobana and Michael Nyman about their work together on the piece Configurations, which launched Shobana's career as a choreographer. Today, we're turning the spotlight on Faultline. Faultline was a piece created in 2007. When I saw it, I knew it was about British Asian youth, but the thing I really took away from it was its mood, which was deeply unsettled and maybe even eerie. At first sight, it looked quite familiar and recognisable because the opening video by Pete Gomes is suburban houses, nattily dressed young Asian men hanging out in the street, and they have that slightly tense swagger that's both a bit show-off and a bit defensive at the same time. So that sets the scene, but the piece takes it to places that I didn't expect. First of all, there was the choreographic style, which was a real hodgepodge of contemporary dance, martial arts, classical Indian dance, plus everyday movement and quite a lot of just posing, really. There's 8 dancers, 4 men and 4 women, and they're dressed in rather natty street style. They're very cool. And that choppy, mixed-up kind of style with its jab and flinch and its shifting gears and direction started to generate that feeling of anxiety, but also a kind of coolness. So it's a bit like if Shobana's classical dance style is her first language, then this is the slang. But then what really makes it eerie for me is the sound and the singer. The score is a mixture of electronic noise and this high, wandering soprano voice. And the singer herself, Patricia Rozario, she's hidden behind a screen, but sometimes she manifests and fades like an apparition in the background. Towards the end, she appears on the video as this giant, sari-clad figure rising up like a haunting spirit from inside the house. And at the end, the camera moves very slowly in towards the house, and you start feeling like the most unnerving and unknowable thing in the whole piece is not actually out there on the street, it's home. Faultline was created in 2007. It has 3 main starting points, and perhaps the earliest was a shift in cultural climate that Shobana sensed after the 2005 London bombings, in which young Asian men in particular became objects of suspicion and mistrust. I'm here with Shobana Jayasingh to talk about Faultline. That's how I felt when I saw it, it's how I remember it, and it speaks to my own attraction to the kind of spookiness of the piece. Can you tell us how you actually started and what the triggers were for the ideas?
I think that unease is absolutely spot on because I think that's really the sort of dominant element that I wanted to stage. And there were many triggers and some of them were just accidental because obviously the 2 bombings of London was something that took everybody by surprise, including me. So I think that there was that unease created for all Asians at that point, young Asians. So it was, that was already in subconscious, if you like. The day that it happened, actually I was choreographing at the place, London Contemporary Dance School at the place, and one of the bombs actually went off quite near there, the bomb on the bus. And actually we were supposed to have a premiere that evening, and I think we had to cancel it. So it was something that really affected everyone. And also, I think the whole sort of reference to doors, I think it probably happened in the early months of the year when Faultline was choreographed, because that sort of suspicion and uneasiness for the people in Britain in general, I think it was such a shock to know that the bombers were homegrown, as it were. Then there were people you might see in the street, you would never actually think of them as wanting to harm you. I think there was a real kind of questioning of appearance. And I remember there was a very well-publicized raid on 2 Asian brothers who lived in a suburban house just like the ones that we see in the Faultline film. In this case, I think the police actually burst in, but in fact it was a false alarm. The people who lived there weren't the people whom the police thought they were. But I think it was very symptomatic of that kind of sort of a hysterical unease that was there, which obviously also resulted in the death of the wrong man in the tube. So I think it was that kind of psychology of not knowing whether one should trust anything that one sees, especially if it looked Asian and young and male.
Members of your company are Asian and young and male. They also sense this
I
same
think,
shift?
definitely, because, there were a couple of anecdotes where they were questioned by the police at that time. So I think if you were male and Asian, you definitely felt somehow scrutinized in a slightly more vigorous way than you would normally. So I think that was definitely part of the way Faultline looks and looked.
It's interesting how entirely different this is from Configurations, which was such a self-defined, self-contained world. And this weaving together a whole load of different strands, narratively, visually, musically, culturally. It must have been a great challenge for all of you to pull together.
So I had about 6 or 7 different creative conversations happening all at the same time. So you're trying to knit the conversations, but they have to be separate for very good reasons. The film was the prologue, and without that, Faultline would be read completely differently. So the 3 men seemed to come out of the film because they came out of the screen where the film was projected. And then you had this very strong sense of these 3 posturing guys. The women come in, then you see it's like a close-up of the women, and it's almost like a camera just zooms just onto these women. These women then have duets with the men. There's one particular thing where the female dancer actually just like lifts the man up. So there's a lot of lifts that the women do with the men. So they have a very particular kind of feisty relationship with the men, almost like to say, well, actually, if you can pose and strut, we're even better at posing and strutting than you could ever be. And then it goes on to then back onto the men and sort of relationship with the men. And then finally, very gradually, actually other dancers are introduced, and it goes into this kind of very group image. I was thinking really of a folk dance. So from having this close-up onto these very stylized individuals, almost like caricatures, you go into this top shot. You see the pattern they make, but not from that close-up angle. You see the pattern they make from a very objective angle. You're kind of looking at them. For me, it was a bit like if the camera had gone onto the pavement and looked at a particular person, and suddenly it's kind of shifted way above the city. So all these people's personalities have become much more muted, and really you see them as people in society.
That's also when the voice really takes over from above, it seems. Yes.
And then also that's when you see the doors. So you kind of go into this city. It's not about individuals anymore. It's just about pattern making, which is, I suppose, when you see people en masse, that's what it is, I was reading Gautam Malkani's book, Londonstani, and I was very struck by the way young Asians were portrayed in that book. More than the characters, I was actually really attracted by the way he created the language that they spoke, which I think in a way mirrors what happened in the studio, because that was an incredible mixture of slang and a lot of derived from street culture. And also because they were Indian, there were a lot of kind of Bollywood references, all mixed in together with a very strong sense of family. So, you'd have a very tough man who'd just kick someone in the teeth for calling him Paki, but at the same time, on his stolen mobile phone, he's talking to his mum and saying, yes, I will buy the samosas for tea today. So there was a really interesting palette that made the characters in Londonstani.
There was this contradiction that I grew up with at school, which was that if you didn't listen to gangster rap, you weren't seen as Asian, you were seen as a coconut. And so I always felt it was really paradoxical that why have we embraced gangster rap as our subculture? Because we have so many facets of a wonderful culture, and bear in mind there was also the kind of Asian underground at the time, you know. So what was going on with that?
I'm here with Gautam Malkani, who is the author of Londonstani. When you wrote Londonstani, it was published in 2006. It was your first book. Can you tell us a bit about the subject matter and the style?
I went to school in Hounslow in West London, and the kind of Hounslow Asian rude boy scene was a big thing in the 90s. And it coincided with Britpop, when dominant white youth culture was getting more and more androgynous. Do you remember Pulp and Blur and Suede? You know, there was this kind of feeling that white culture is effeminate. That was why hip-hop had been co-opted as being a marker of your Asianness. There was this kind of drive for hypermasculinity and machismo, and yeah, I was constantly fascinated by it. I knew I wanted to write a book about it. I could never make it work as non-fiction, so I turned it into a novel.
What I found also really intriguing about Londonstani is that these were middle-class boys, and the posing was very much part of their armory. It's a very Indian phenomena, I think, the sort of the Asian gang. It had lots of contradictory elements, and as a fellow Asian, you recognize lots of hints and clues.
So that was something that you really recognized. It seemed to have a truth to it, an experience. And it also found a new language, didn't it? It found its own language.
Yeah, it was very reminiscent of Clockwork Orange, for example, because there it wasn't really the psychological realism of the characters. It was actually the language that was revealing of the character. So I think in Londonstani, it was very much like that.
The language came about very late in the process, actually. And I realised as I wrote that it just didn't work to write about this world without really vibrant language. Because it's the kind of book that I wish I had when I was in sixth form in school, right? So I wanted the book to be read by young British Asians. And I felt like, language is so much a part of it. And so I was like, okay, let's have fun with the language. And I've always loved books with a vernacular. And I thought the hypermasculinity that I was looking at in the research and that I'd experienced at school was basically conveyed through language. Words were a kind of muscle.
The book and the extracts of the book made a huge impact on how this creative phase of the choreography, the movement generation phase, you know. And for example, there was a dancer there called Rashpal Bansal who sadly took his own life a few years later. He, in a way, could have been a character in this book. He was from the East End. He really felt very torn between his perceived Asianness and the way he saw himself. So I think it was a subject that they all understood and had an opinion about. And I think that's a real boon to a choreographer. The opening image, which I was really struck by, is the head of this Asian gang. His name was Harjit, but he calls himself Hardjit. And basically, he's kicking someone very, very brutally, this young white guy. But the way the whole incident is described is very stylized. It's almost quite cartoonish and quite comic. And so I just found the sort of flavor of the description. I think that's something I took into the studio because I think it was that extreme stylization. It wasn't really about psychological reality at all. It was really how, I suppose, classical dance works like that. Bharatanatyam certainly does. It's just about the sort of monumentality of something you're portraying. It's larger than life.
Oh, I'll read the opening, which is a fight scene. There's a lot of swearing in it because, as I said, I wanted to show language as a tool of hypermasculinity. Serve him right, he got his motherfucking face fucked. He shouldn't be calling me a packy, innit? After spitting his words out, Harjit stopped for a second like he expected us to write him down or some shit. Then he sticks in an exclamation mark by kicking the white kid in the face again. Shouldn't be calling us packies, innit, you dirty Gora. Again, punctuation come with a kick, but with his left foot this time, so it was more like a semicolon. Call me or any of my brethrens a packy again and I'ma mash you and your family. Isn't that the truth, packies? That's right, Amit, Ravi and I go. That be the truth.
I did take bits of Gautam's book, just thinking and talking about the characters in the book and saying, how we could physicalize those characters. And, that really made a big contribution to the vocabulary. And to make this kind of hybrid characters, so we had kind of Bollywood, we had a bit of hip-hop, martial arts, we had Bharatanatyam, just to mine gestures and sort of narrative vocabulary from lots of different types of sources. A bit like what the book was doing with the language.
Ravi then delivers his standard solo routine. Yeah, blood, safe, innit? Hear what my brethren be saying, Salah Kutta. Come out with that shit again and I'ma knock you so hard you be shitting out your mouth for real, innit? Goes Harjit with an eloquence and conviction that made me green with envy. Standing there in his designer desi garms, a tiger tattooed on his left shoulder and a Sikh Kanda symbol on his right bicep. He probably could have fit a whole page of holy scriptures on his biceps if he wanted to. The guy worked every major muscle group down the gym every other day since he was fucking 14 years old. Since, despite his mum's best efforts, he hit puberty and became a proper desi boy. He even drinks that powdery protein shit they sell down there, but she don't care because he mixes it in with milk. What's happening is, instead of defining masculinity in relation to the fathers, they're defining their masculinity in opposition to their mothers. It's like a kind of reactionary identity, and often that is because we don't really know our fathers, or we don't have that closeness with our fathers. There's not much to emulate, or there is an absence of a father, or there's a domineering mother. But you get the idea that the identity is defined in opposition rather than in relation, and so the mother figures become really important. The Italians have a name for this phenomena. They call it mamismo, which is, a conflation of mum and machismo. It's a genre in Italy. And this is the kind of masculinity that you get when it's a mummy's boy hyper-masculinity.
Of the many reactions you had to your book, one that I'm sure you didn't predict was being contacted by Shobana Jayasinghe to say that this book has been an inspiration for a piece of choreography.
Yeah, no, that came completely out of the blue. I got an email via my agent about performance of Faultline at the South Bank, and I was completely gobsmacked and really, really overjoyed that she was interested in the book. But when I saw it, I was incredibly moved that she got it better than I got it. With Faultline, she seemed to get to the essence of something that I hadn't quite even got to because I was distracted by all the fashion and the noise, and she stripped a lot of that out. Bear in mind that at this stage I had absolutely zero experience of contemporary dance. I didn't know anything about the world. So it was just really overwhelming to me to see how she could get to the essence of what I was trying to get at much more directly. You watch Faultline and you get the mamismo. Actually, you get the type of masculinity, the type of performed masculinity that I was trying to capture, but the choreography seemed to cut to the core of it much more clearly than I did. And that was really amazing to see. And I had a conversation with her, and she said afterwards, and she said something. Again, it was a case of, I get what the book is supposed to be trying to convey. And she talked about wanting to explore, quote, the thin line between aggression and vanity. That is essentially what happens with mamismo. The performed machismo is also very vain. And there are moments in Faultline where the hand gestures, and there's that kind of, Keanu Reeves does it in The Matrix. Says, come on, bring it on. But it's such a kind of delicate gesture in Faultline. It's that thin line between violence and vanity is sometimes expressed in an effort to choreograph raw aggression. I mean, I can't describe it better than the dance describes it. And that's one of the things that overwhelmed me, was I suddenly learned through that just how effective dance can be to convey things that I spent pages trying to convey, and she conveyed it so beautifully and directly. Yeah, it was quite overwhelming.
This is Surface Tension, the podcast from Shobana Jayasinghe Dance, with me, Sanjoy Roy. You can subscribe to Surface Tension on iTunes so you don't miss an episode. And if you are enjoying this series, please leave us a rating or review. I feel a bit weird saying hello, Scanner.
Yeah. Say Robin, because it's more human.
Robin,
yeah.
And the surname is Rimbaud.
Yeah, it's not Rimbaud and end up in that funny.
Who composes under the name of Scanner.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm here with Robin Rimbaud, who composed the score for Shobana Jayasingh's Faultline. I understand that Shobana initially heard a piece that you'd done before she started work on the piece, and it was an electronically distorted soprano voice. Is that right?
I'd been working with Wayne McGregor on a piece, and they were friends with each other, and our paths just frequently crossed. And she just said, "Can I hear some of your music?" And so I gave her unheard pieces, just sketches I made in the studio. So in some ways, these were just demos, and they were using the voice and looping it and slowing it down and speeding it up and creating these kind of otherworldly, abstract kind of soundscapes.
There was a sense of being trapped and a sort of a hopelessness. I thought that little bit was just amazing. I just found it very emotional.
I found out the old emails the other day from 2006, which might be of value to quote to you, which is quite fun. August 2006. I love the dark, charged and intense atmosphere that the voice and your score creates, and I'm taking the cue for the visuals from that. I would love to have the same atmosphere for our piece. I spoke to the soprano singer Patricia Rozario, and she was very interested in being involved. The question is, what would Patricia sing? So in a sense, quite early on.
Had a vision.
Yeah. So I had this series of kind of soundscapes, these pieces, and began to shape them with feedback from Shobana. I like to use sounds often and process them and treat them in a way. So it sounds like you're hearing somebody having a conversation through a wall, but you can't quite hear it. Or it's the sound of the traffic rumble. So inside Faultline are all these kinds of gritty, urban, disposable sounds. They're kind of ugly to many ears, and there's something I find quite beautiful. They are a picture of that city at a certain time. To me, it felt very much like London at that time, the music.
The way you describe it there sounds to me like what we just don't notice around us has somehow been incorporated in the background of your
Something I love,
texture.
absolutely. I've always been drawn to an idea that we are immersed in radio signals. So if you have the correct machine to pick these up, you'd be able to pick up all these kind of signals passing through us at all times. We don't hear them. But I like, in some sense, of being the receiver, so to speak, picking these things up and using them through the work. What Faultline has in its essence is a picture, in sound certainly, of a certain time, and that's buried inside this kind of quite ethereal voice at times, this kind of very real element, the human voice, some electronics, but something that to me never feels electronic. That was always the important thing. I always wanted something that people feel. I want them to have an emotional response to it, and I think that worked.
Yes, I definitely do as well. It was very unsettling. There's nothing quite to get hold of in terms of the root or the beat, but you know that there's quite a lot there, but nothing quite graspable.
It's easy to dismiss electronic music as something inhuman, as something robotic, as something completely artificial. And what I've always tried to do is have it possess a humanity.
Can I ask about the soprano voice? That was actually scored by Errollyn Wallen. The way you talked about picking up radio signals, certainly a lot of the soprano reminds me of that wavering picking up a radio voice that has the quality of sliding between dials on a station. Was that intentional? Did it happen? Was it me?
Probably the biggest challenge of the entire piece was that sequence, actually. We had an electronic sequence, a kind of abstract texture, and Shobana wanted a voice in it. I didn't feel confident that I had the skill set to score a voice within it. But Shobana was committed to having Patricia in it.
She had this huge operatic presence, and I think the soprano voice for me is one of the most non-naturalistic sounds. It's that quality that I really wanted to bring in.
My name is Errollyn Wallen, and I'm a composer. John Taverner, the composer, loved Patricia's voice for the same reasons I do. It's extremely expressive. At a certain range, I'd say the top quarter of her voice sounds like no other singer. It's a very, very special voice, and I felt for Faultline my job was to bring out all aspects of her voice, but also to shape and contour the vocal writing so that I'd make use of these magical elements she has.
Errollyn came in, a very capable composer. We met, got on fabulously. She wrote a piece for it, and the initial piece just didn't work.
I wrote something and Shobana absolutely hated it. So Shobana had given me a brief and she wanted something quite wild and angular. And I went to the extremes and that was the wrong thing. I had a sense of the work, but do you know what's really, really hard? One person fully communicating the whole feeling and aesthetic of a work, that was still growing, as well as, of course, wanting to write something that complemented Robin's track. It was a tricky situation for me. I didn't have total freedom.
There's this sense, I felt sometimes, that there's my part and her part, and sometimes they feel like two cars going on the highway at the same time. And they've both got their radios blaring, they wind down the windows, and these two things kind of interfere with each other. And as ugly, and truthfully, I feel it's quite ugly at times, that sequence. In the end, this thing came to shape, but it was a really tough moment.
The choreographer has a vision and has to bring a whole team alongside, but it's trying to impart that vision and keep everybody together.
It's not easy, two composers making a piece of music, and not separately but together. And I think I really have to salute both Robin and Errollyn, because actually it was an incredibly generous thing to do, because it's like merging your compositional signature with somebody else. And I mean, that's a big, big ask, really. But they managed to sign off a fantastic dance score.
Once it came into shape, it was fantastic, because for an audience, you've got this thing playing back, and the presence of the music is there but not there. There's not a band on stage playing this with instruments. Then the voice would appear, and you would see Patricia, and suddenly this thing changed. The whole mood changed, and it suddenly became something much more humane. This voice is humanising what you're hearing in an artificial way. And it worked, but goodness, that wasn't easy to get to. Certainly for me and Errollyn, I know.
Actually, in the second version, I just felt I'll just be myself. I'll do what I feel is required. The extract we were using was Blue Teneur from Bach, and he's my favourite composer, so I was enjoying taking snippets from that. My muse was definitely Patricia's voice, so little things like towards the end of Faultline, she sings higher and higher and higher, and I know she can do that, and I knew ahead of time what that effect would be. So everything grows, the whole track grows, but my job was to make things seamlessly work together so that you wouldn't think, oh, there were two composers.
When you finally got to see the performance complete, how did you feel?
It was a very ambitious project, but I felt a very important work. Some of that is the quality of Patricia's voice, and I write for different sorts of music all the time, and it's a gift to write for a great artist. And I'm very proud of it.
This is Surface Tension, the podcast from Shobana Jayasingh Dance, with me, Sanjoy Roy.
My name is Pete Gomes. I'm an artist, filmmaker and collaborator with Shobana Jayasingh on Faultline. The starting point was actually a recce with Shobana in Southall, and Shobana and I spent a few hours looking at things, talking about things. Shobana's eye started to pick out particular motifs, positions, architecture that led to a discussion about how the project might progress. And at that stage, I think the working title was Lacrimé. So there was a real sense of a lament, in some senses, which coloured the kinds of images and conversations we were having as we walked through the area. And Shobana's ideas were very, very specific. There were specific motifs, one being the mouth, referring specifically to Patricia's mouth and singing mouth. The domestic house, a kind of suburban house. And then I also noticed there was a particular direction to engage with people in the street. And this was a suggestion that I might approach people in the street or interact or film people in the street. And she was very specific. She said, not documentary. She said something much more archetypal.
I always knew that film was going to be a really important part. So my first creative collaborator was Pete Gomes. And we were actually talking about that incident of the police raid on these houses and the way these doors just look so normal. And there were just a whole line of terraced houses where you'd think very normal things would be happening. So we wanted it to have a Gothic feel. So that's really the kind of aesthetic we were looking at. So it was black and white, and we decided to film these black birds that happened to be flying off from a puddle. And we were very lucky because we didn't want to have actors, but I think Pete was walking around Brick Lane and he found these two guys who actually ended up in the film.
I saw these two Asian lads. They had some attitude. They were a little bit edgy. They were a little bit naughty. They had that quality in them. And I approached them and asked whether they would take part, and they agreed. And we just started doing some experiments. I would say things like stand over the other side of the road and walk to me on the other side of the road. I was trying to get wipes of cars that would give me cutting points. So I was experimenting with how I was going to construct the film.
As these two guys walked down the street, there was an old Muslim man with a plastic shopping bag just crossing the road in the opposite direction. And again, that was a kind of like a motif that really created itself. The two different generations just going in seemingly opposite directions.
There was a visual collision between two eras. The lads they were just British lads. I think that's the way I read them. They were into their trainers, they liked, their chains, the bit of bling, biker jackets, but very stylised. They had a kind of particular look. And there's another section that immediately follows that, which was shot in camera. And that was using 8mm on a time-lapse where I moved the camera around them. So you get a kind of flickering montage of trainers, close-ups of their hands, rings, and other details, but done in camera as a continual sequence. There were 3 stages of shooting. One was in a studio with Patricia, which was stylized, lit. It used a rig that allowed the camera to move in a particular way, and the shots were preconceived. There were documentary material that was shot in the street, out of a car sometimes, of a house, figures in the street, birds in a puddle, and houses, for example. And then the other component part was the two lads, which was a kind of staged, improvised documentary feel, but it was a constructed image. Shobana and I were talking a lot about the notion of unease. There was a really unsettled quality to it, and that drew my eye to certain things. The birds, for example, they had the kind of slight tension around them. So one of the references for unease was David Lynch and the way he can imbue normal situations with qualities that trigger unease. They trigger a kind of feeling that you can't quite articulate, but it just pushes your psyche into a particular territory. And I think Shobana was very keen on trying to find ways of triggering that feeling.
The figure of Patricia, as she appears both behind the screen and on screen as this apparition, did you have an image of what she represented? A kind of larger presence?
Non-natural, definitely. I think she was always going to have this presence which was non-naturalistic. A huge contrast, like that older gentleman who was walking on the opposite direction of the youth.
The dancers may have been particular characters, but she was very iconic.
She was.
Patricia in that context was very distinct because she was isolated. It was very, very stylized. I understood that filming her in that way was going to generate an image that would rise up from the bottom of the stage. So I think Patricia's presence is quite a shock. I think that's the thing that I really liked about it. It's the last thing you expect to happen, and you're kind of lured into a particular flavour from the beginning, and it's got a certain tone. And then just really when you don't expect it, one, her voice arrives in the piece, which is extraordinary. And then on top of that, this image arrives almost from the underworld in a way.
When she first appears as the large giant image, she looks as if she's been laid to rest slightly because she has her hands crossed, and she's obviously been filmed from above,
she was lying
down.
on the ground.
So it looks like a deathly figure who is rising.
Yeah.
And then at some point she begins to open her eyes, and you see in this loop that she has now opened her eyes and now her mouth is opening.
Yeah, I know, because she's female and she's in a sari. People might think she's the sort of maternal figure. I never really thought of her as a maternal figure. I just thought of her as a powerful figure. I suppose the nearest is like a Greek chorus, a one-woman Greek chorus who would actually comment on the action and who would highlight the action. And so she was part of something that was very separate from the dancers. And that's why she never came out of her space in the thing where she was behind this gauze and she'd appear and she'd disappear. So there's kind of like a supernatural being. But I think the closest really is it's a device like the chorus.
Shobana sort of used the stage like an edit suite, being able to pull in images at a certain point, drop them out, light Patricia on the stage at a certain point, which bleached out the images. And there's this rhythm that occurs between the moving images on the screen and the choreography on the stage that is very sophisticated and's got multiple visual counterpoints going on. One example being there's a moment where all of the dancers are still, apart from one dancer who weaves in and out of everybody, and the image is the walking figures across the screen. So there's this really clear correlation between two kinds of movement, which is just very nuanced and works and balances.
So Shobana, I suppose when I look at the piece and I think of that bravado between the posture and the experience and the ambivalence of identity, it's almost like you're pointing to the fault line between those two things. And I wonder if perhaps that was integral to why you, in fact, came to call it Faultline in the first place.
For many, many months, I called it lacrimae because I always felt it was a kind of like a dirge. Faultline is a bit of a dirge for me. So that really was its first official title. And I think in my laptop, I think it's still filed under lacrimae. But probably it's something that I read. Someone talked about a fault line, cultural fault lines perhaps. And I just thought, okay, it's a title that sort of allows a much more general entry into the piece because lacrimae then just sort of brands it as something morose. So Faultline was the more open title and it kind of signaled something that's slightly at odds. It hasn't quite fractured, but there's a possibility of a fracture. And possibly my son was probably doing his geography lesson and I'm sure that probably was another reason why it was called Faultline.
It's kind of interesting at the moment still as well. There is a fault line. There's a difference that you can't simply erase, which sometimes I think that integration is thought of.
I think people often think that integration is just like a one-way road, that it's all to do with, and it's only ever to do with people who are the foreigners or the aliens or the recent settlers. But actually far more than that, I think the mainstream also has to make it possible. I mean, I used to feel at the beginning, every time I was described as an Anglo-Indian choreographer or an Asian choreographer, that makes it very hard to integrate because, that immediately tells me that there's this huge bracket that I have to put myself in, which is separate and different. So it's a two-way thing. And I think sometimes very subconsciously, people keep on pointing to the difference, which is really not very helpful, instead of pointing to the similarities.
What other kind of reactions do you remember having from this piece? Because it's a very unresolved, not very didactic piece. It's all to do with atmosphere and evocation.
I think I was surprised. I mean, I think people seem to read Faultline quite easily, and it became part of the GCSE dance syllabus. And I remember going to a school in East London and seeing the students there do their own Faultline, and it was brilliant to see them doing that. So Faultline has had a reasonably happy journey. Not all dance pieces do. I think maybe it's because it was a much more open-ended, more sort of cinematic piece, actually. So it was a real pleasure, actually, making Faultline.
It was certainly a pleasure to watch. Part of the pleasure was its complexity and its ambivalence. It's the very source, I think, of why it captures people's imaginations.
Because I think it comes from a lived experience, and that makes a huge difference.
Thanks for listening to Surface Tension, the podcast from Shobana Jayasingh Dance. For more episodes, subscribe to Surface Tension on iTunes, visit our website shobanajayasingh.co.uk, or follow us on Twitter at SJ Sing Dance for updates.